So let me introduce today's speaker. Today's presentation will be given by Philip Tai, Associate Professor in the Department of History at Northeastern University. He received his PhD from Stanford University, where he worked with the leading Qing historians Matt Sommers. He specializes in modern Chinese, East Asian, legal, economic, and Cold War history. His book, China's War on Smuggling, Law, Economic Life, and the Making of the Modern State, 1842 through 1965, was published by Columbia University Press in 2018, and his interdisciplinary research has been supported by many organizations, including the American Council of Learned Societies and the Social Science Research Council. And on top of that, I will also add that Philip is a good friend of mine, and I think he's one of the few people who have actually read my book and understood it. So, so that's a very good thing, I think. Today, Philip Tai will be speaking on China's war on smuggling, law, economic life, and the making of the modern state. Please join me in welcoming him.
All right, can everyone hear me? Oh, yes, it works. Great, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. I want to begin with the usual round of thank yous to the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for sponsoring this talk, for Professor Per Castle for extending this invitation, to Ina Schlaff for organizing the logistics, and I want to thank all of you for attending this event. The turnout on a Tuesday noon is actually quite impressive, so your presence is truly appreciated. This is my first time here in Michigan, and I'm thrilled to be here today to introduce my new book, China's War on Smuggling. I had been working on it for over a decade before it was finally published last year, and it's always really wonderful to finally share something that you've been working on for so long. Very, very excited. So China's War on Smuggling is a legal and economic history of smuggling on the China coast. It begins from the last decades of the Qing dynasty, continues through the Republic of China in the early 20th century, and it ends with the early years of the People's Republic in the 1960s. It looks at smuggling from different angles. It looks at the practice of smuggling, basically how individuals, how businesses, how gangs, how fishermen, even whole villages would traffic goods of all kinds. Goods that range from dangerous contraband like drugs and weapons to very ordinary products like sugar, wristwatches. The book also looks at the suppression of smuggling, basically how successive governments, their agents, various institutions fought smuggling, how they enforce anti-smuggling laws. Now, during the course of my research, I came to learn that smuggling was actually a very widespread practice on the China coast. I had unearthed a treasure trove of stories, stories of ingenious traffickers, stories of state violence, state brutality, snapshots of ordinary life. Indeed, I came to realize that smuggling was everywhere. It was an inescapable reality in modern China. But even more important than this pervasiveness of smuggling was the significance of smuggling. During my research, I came to realize that smuggling was much more than just this collection of very vivid stories, sensational cases. Collectively, these stories demonstrate how smuggling intersected with many key issues in modern Chinese history and modern statecraft more generally. Questions about the expansion of state power, questions about the challenges to the expansion of state power. And I've also come to discover that smuggling also intersects with many key issues confronting China even today. Questions about trade, questions about tariffs, questions about policing, questions that are still in the headlines. And all of this forms the essential argument for my book, which is that tracing the history of smuggling shows us how Chinese states throughout history have continually expanded their control over the economy, over everyday life. Smuggling may well have existed on the margins of the law, but it was far from marginal in driving many important historical changes. So today I'm going to offer a very general overview, a very general introduction to my book. I'm going to provide an overview of the book's coverage, the sources, what the book focuses on, what kind of materials it uses. Then I'm going to survey the major themes of my book. And finally, I'm going to end with some thoughts on the broader significance of my findings, not only for our understanding of China more specifically, but also for our understanding of modern history beyond China more generally. So let me begin with an overview of my book. So China's war on smuggling is divided into 7 chapters. It unfolds chronologically and it unfolds thematically by focusing on different facets of smuggling and its suppression. Themes like the business of smuggling, the dynamics of warfare, wartime smuggling, and so forth. Now, in explaining the overall arc of my book, I usually get a lot of questions. Questions about what was smuggled, questions about how things were smuggled, questions about who did the smuggling, essentially questions of what, how, and who. And my very short answer is basically everything, anyway, everyone. But of course, the long and very complicated answer is that it really depends, because smuggling is a crime created by the state through regulation, through taxation, through enforcement, and it is shaped by changing contexts that are political, economic, social, cultural. So what is smuggled always changes. So I look at smuggling as a legal category rather than simply the trafficking of any one commodity. And indeed, the composition, the dynamics of smuggling were always in flux. They were always changing. So during the late Qing, smuggling was defined rather narrowly to include the transport, the sale of a very handful of commodities like opium, weapons, salt. But as the Republican and the communist governments, introduced new laws, introduced new regulations, new tariffs, new economic controls, the definition of smuggling gradually expanded. In the process, many ordinary consumables were transformed into profitable contraband, goods that would be seemingly innocuous, goods like sugar for food, rayon for clothing, kerosene for lighting, and so forth. Now, I choose to offer this very broad coverage, temporal coverage, so that we can better see the changes as well as the continuities in the practice and the suppression of smuggling, basically looking at how things certainly have changed, but also how many things surprisingly stayed the same. As for the geographical setting of my book, I focus on the China coast, which contains some of the most economically advanced regions in modern China. Smuggling was very active here as smugglers took advantage of large markets, extensive transportation networks. They also took advantage of these vast geographies to move their goods in secret. I should note that while smuggling was very active in China's continental frontiers, that is the frontiers, land borders, I looked to the coast because smuggling was very active here, but also the coast was also a region of strategic concerns for many Chinese regimes. And so I look at this place because this is also where modern Chinese governments looked. As for the empirical core of my study, I draw from a diverse array of materials. I employ what I call official sources. These are sources that are produced by states, produced by state agents. They include everything from government reports, customs records, diplomatic correspondences. And they are very critical because they show us how states defined smuggling, how state imperatives were expressed through laws, through regulations, how these definitions would change over time, and how these definitions were enforced on the ground, as well as in the courtroom. Now, these official sources are critical to our understanding of smuggling. We need to know how the crime was defined. But these sources are also incomplete, because as criminologists and other scholars have warned, studying the history of crime is very difficult because these sources are very elusive, very problematic. Many crimes operated in the shadows. Many more crimes would escape the attention of officials. And this is especially true for an activity like smuggling, because very often the incidents of smuggling that you would find in the archives, they are precisely there because, if you think about it, they were incidents of failure. Because only bad smugglers get caught. Good smugglers, are never, don't get caught. They may not even come to the attention of officials. So if you rely only on these official sources, you're going to get a very skewed picture of the realities on the ground. And of course, this reliance on official sources could lead to another problem. And this problem is inadvertently reproducing what scholars might call the state-centered discourse of illegality. That is, what governments, what officials, and what laws consider to be illegal, but not what everyone else considered to be illegal or even immoral. So we cannot rely exclusively on official sources. And to provide a more complete picture of smuggling, we need to look beyond official sources to what I would call non-official sources. So these are sources that are not produced by the state or state agents, sources that could give us information, give us perspectives that are not captured in official sources. And in my book, I use various non-official sources like popular press reports, newspapers, and magazines. I even employ other materials like literary fiction, showing how the Chinese public might have imagined smuggling and how this imagination reflected broader social attitudes. Now, this in particular is a children's story. A children's story about two siblings, a brother and a sister, who uncover a smuggling hideout, foil a smuggling gang who kidnap their father, and they rescue him in the process. A really very interesting story. Besides these sources, I also draw from visual sources, sources like political cartoons, like this one. This one is entitled Blood Transfusion, this political cartoon, which shows the very sickly man of Chinese industry and commerce. He's being bled to death by smuggling. This is a very common theme, by the way, in Chinese political cartoons, which frequently railed against smuggling as a form of economic invasion and a threat to domestic Chinese industries. By the way, if you are interested in seeing more of these political cartoons, I would be very happy to show you more of them during the Q&A. Now, in any case, I try to use this diverse set of official and non-official sources, which I hope will paint a much more accurate and much more complete picture of trafficking on the China coast, a picture that captures as many incidents as possible to better reconstruct different perspectives, whether we're talking about perspectives from the government to the governed, state and the smuggler, elite and public, and so forth. Let me now briefly discuss the themes of my book. Basically, what are the broader developments, the broader changes that my book traces? And here I'm going to draw some different examples from China's war on smuggling to highlight three major themes that my book covers. So the first theme is smuggling and the expansion of state capacity. That is, how smuggling helped increase state power. Now, China's war on smuggling is set during a very tumultuous period in Chinese history. As many of you probably already know, from the mid-19th through the mid-20th centuries, China was confronted by domestic strife, many devastating rebellions, and it was also confronted with considerable foreign pressures. And China had suffered many humiliating military defeats. These defeats included everything from the Opium Wars to the First Sino-Japanese War and so forth. In the wake of these military defeats, China was compelled to sign a series of so-called unequal treaties. These treaties would place very restrictive constraints on the authority of the Chinese government or successive Chinese governments. They would grant considerable privileges to foreign powers. China, for instance, had to surrender its tariff autonomy, that is, its right to set tariffs. It had to agree to fix tariffs on foreign goods at a very flat rate of 5%. China also had to grant what is known as extraterritoriality to foreigners on Chinese soil, foreign concessions within the country, effectively giving foreigners de facto immunity from Chinese laws. So this was a period when China and Chinese authority was besieged both domestically and internationally. But at the same time that this authority was being besieged, there was sort of this countervailing development that was beginning to unfold. Because during this period, successive Chinese regimes, governments, embarked on a series of so-called self-strengthening or state-building initiatives. These were attempts to build the institutions, to build the foundations of a modern state, a state that would be basically capable of exercising domestic control, a state better capable of meeting foreign challenges, a state capable of modernizing the economy. And these state-building efforts included everything from establishing new institutions, new bureaucracies, creating a new modern military, promoting strategic industries, investing in economically vital locales. But there was also another important state-building initiative, that is ensuring a sufficient and reliable source of funding. And here, fighting smuggling played an important role, because both the late Qing and the Republican governments were very, very reliant on customs duties for money. Basically, they needed customs duties to fund these initiatives. So fighting smuggling to protect tariff revenues was not a trivial matter. So let me just show you a few numbers. So during the 1890s, for instance, during the late Qing, customs duties were estimated to be the second largest source of central government revenues, making up an estimated 1/4 of the government's finances. And if you include other taxes that might be harmed by smuggling, by trafficking, taxes on opium, taxes on salt, and so forth, you can appreciate the importance of fighting smuggling for the Qing state. Basically, fighting smuggling protected a big, big part of the government's revenues. And this dependence, by the way, this dependence on customs duties only grew in the 20th century. So in 1928, the nationalist government would recover China's tariff autonomy. That is, it finally won the right to set tariffs on foreign goods. And this government would proceed to use tariff policies, customs duties, to realize the government's goal of unifying and modernizing China. So during the decade before the Second Sino-Japanese War in 1937, tariffs on imports made up about half of the government's overall revenues. These figures basically show the revenues for this 10-year period, 1928 to 1937. This is overall numbers. If you actually look at specific years, in some years, customs duties actually made up anywhere from 60 to even 70% of overall revenues. So when you keep all these numbers in mind, you can really appreciate why smuggling was such a threat to Chinese states, and why fighting smuggling was very important. It's so critical to protecting state finances. But fighting smuggling also helped expand state capacity in other ways. As more laws were passed and enforcement was further intensified, Chinese states would begin to exercise more control over society and economy. It helped enforce what authorities deemed to be legal and illegal commerce. It extended state reach by dispatching more state agents to enforce state authority on the ground, on land, on water, in the court. Fighting smuggling also enhanced state coercion by arming these agents with very lethal weapons. And then it would legitimize their authority, legitimize their use of force by passing new laws and new regulations. So one of the ironies that I realized over the course of research is that all of this policing, all of this interdiction, all of this escalation, in the end, essentially created more smuggling. After all, when you think about it, trade is only smuggling if it is illegal, because if it's not illegal, it's just trade. So as new laws, new regulations would would put more restrictions on the freedom to trade, as new taxes would make the import of goods more expensive, all of this simply encouraged more smuggling, even as state capacity gradually expanded to fight smuggling, to basically fight smuggling that its own policies actually helped create. And all of this reminds me of an old axiom about state power provided by the great sociologist Charles Tilly, who I believe actually used to teach here, right? Yes. Charles Tilly postulated a very tight intimate relationship between state making and war making when he declared that states made war, but wars made states. But when you look at the case of China's war on smuggling, in my opinion, this offers a new twist on this old axiom, namely that states might have made smuggling, but fighting smuggling ultimately remade states. Now, smuggling and the expansion of state capacity, this neatly dovetails into the second theme of my book, smuggling and the centralization of legal authority. Basically, how fighting smuggling helped concentrate, helped reinforce state authority. Now, fighting smuggling, I believe, is a classic example of what one historian might call asserting sovereignty through policing. That is, using the fight against smuggling to use it as an opportunity to vigorously, to aggressively assert Chinese authority, exclusive authority in enforcing, adjudicating anti-smuggling laws. So basically, the government wants to have the final say, want to exercise the final authority on what it considered to be smuggling and who would be punished for it. And this assertion of sovereignty took different forms. So during the, under the nationalist government in the early 20th century, for instance, fighting smuggling went hand in hand with the introduction of new laws, new regulations. The government would pass an array of new laws and regulations, a few sample of which I have shown above. These were laws and regulations that empowered state agents to conduct more expansive, more invasive searches. These were laws and regulations that required sailors, required fishermen to register their vessels, to submit to regular inspections. Laws and regulations that required anyone suspected of smuggling, anyone arrested for smuggling, to deal with the central government. Again, these laws and regulations were intended to fight smuggling, but they were also intimately tied with efforts to centralize domestic state authority. Now, meanwhile, fighting smuggling also helps centralize legal authority in another way by helping unwind the external constraints on domestic authority. And the best example of this unwinding is the fight against extraterritoriality. Again, extraterritoriality, the right of foreigners in China to be governed by the laws of their own countries rather than the laws of China. Now, when we look at the history of extraterritoriality in China, the general narrative is that it usually begins with the Treaty of Nanjing, signed in 1842, after China's defeat in the Opium War, which exempted foreigners in China from Chinese authority and Chinese laws. Extraterritoriality was not abrogated, was not undone until 1943, when foreign powers finally agreed to relinquish their extraterritorial privileges, thereby ending the so-called century of humiliation for China. This is, by the way, why Chinese government today is so insistent on sovereignty, 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 above all else. This story that I just sketched out, this is the classic narrative of extraterritoriality's rise and demise within China, and it is accurate, it's not wrong. But unfortunately, I would say it is also incomplete, because in my book, I try to highlight the many ways that fighting smuggling consistently challenged extraterritoriality, how fighting smuggling helped play a very important but unrecognized role in unwinding extraterritoriality from the bottom up in everyday ways. After all, every time Chinese authorities in the course of fighting smuggling, let's say they want a fine, let's say they want to levy a fine on a British businessman for submitting a falsified invoice, or any time they sought to confiscate, say, a Japanese fishing boat for smuggling, or any time they tried to enter a foreign concession to arrest a suspected smuggler. All of these seemingly inconsequential episodes of law enforcement actually held considerable consequences by helping Chinese authorities chip away at these foreign privileges and foreign imperialism. So basically, every time they're trying to enforce anti-smuggling laws. They came up against this problem, extraterritoriality, and they would have all these negotiations to try to unwind that. So fighting smuggling, I would argue, would show how this dismantling of extraterritoriality did not unfold just at the diplomatic table, meaning that it's not just something that, that unfolded between diplomats and their discussions. I would say they were consistently challenged on the ground as Chinese authorities would fight smuggling, would police trade. This is another sort of another angle to look at this demise of extraterritoriality and understand how the Chinese state would try to centralize legal authority. So, fighting smuggling played an integral role in the expansion of state capacity, and it also played an integral role in the centralization of legal authority. But fighting smuggling also provides a very interesting window into the third theme of my book, which is the transformation of economic life. How the fight against smuggling offers some very interesting, some unconventional snapshots into how the economy actually worked. Like, for instance, how goods were exchanged, how smuggling was actually financed, how partnerships were forged, how deliveries were coordinated, basically how businesses operated how smuggling operated like a business. All these sort of very interesting ways of looking at the economy. So in my book, I try to balance the coverage of smuggling by inverting the state-centered perspective, meaning I don't want to just look at what the state thought was smuggling. I really wanted to look at how smugglers themselves acted, thought, operated, and look at the business of smuggling. So in my book, I look at many companies, many organizations that were engaged in smuggling. One company was this company known as the Zhongyuan Trading Company, which smuggled Japanese goods by operating a very vast, very sophisticated logistics network. This pipeline stretched all the way from suppliers in Osaka in Japan, all the way to the streets of Qingdao, this port on the China coast. And the Zhongyuan Trading Company, by the way, was just one of many, 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 many firms that operated on the margins of the law. And looking at their operation reveal these many creative strategies businesses use to respond to new laws and new regulations. So basically, as Chinese governments at this time were passing new laws, promulgating new regulations, businesses, a lot of them complied, certainly, but a lot of them responded in very creative ways. Smuggling, evasion, and so forth, those are just some of the tactics of responses. Furthermore, looking at smuggling could also uncover some very surprising facets of economic life in other settings. So for instance, in my final chapter, the final chapter of my book covers smuggling in the early People's Republic. In that chapter, I unearthed some very surprising examples of how pervasive smuggling was, and also how important smuggling was. During this period, as many of you probably already know, China was moving towards what the new government called socialist transformation. That is, disbanding private enterprises, moving China towards a more centrally planned command economy. Now, originally, when I was trying to put the research together for this chapter, I talked to many scholars about my intention to look at smuggling in the early People's Republic. And when I did so, when I talked to scholars, whether they were in China or here in the States or elsewhere, many of these scholars actually expressed a lot of skepticism, because all of them, nearly all of them, told me, "Oh yeah, smuggling. That was very widespread before 1949. It's also very widespread after 1978 during the reform period. But during the Maoist period, they say, no way." No smuggling. No smuggling during the Maoist period. Not during this time when supposedly the state was dominating every facet of the economy. At first, when I heard that, I thought, okay, well, all right, maybe that made sense. But during the course of my research, I found out that smuggling was not only widespread during this period, it was also very important to the shift to the command economy. Smuggling, in fact, proved vital to supporting certain parts of this new command economy. And its dynamics highlight the very surprising symbiotic relationship between the illicit economy and the new command economy. Indeed, as communist China was shifting towards central planning with greater government control, these mismatches between supply and demand frequently emerged. As China moved to focus more on heavy industry, consumer austerity became widespread. As China was beginning to build these big steel factories, these big, and other kinds of industrial projects, other industries, like consumer industries, were neglected. Consumer goods like wristwatches, fountain pens, cosmetics, these were goods that were deemed non-essential, useless luxury goods by the new government. These were goods that were prohibited from import, heavily taxed, and generally neglected by this new government. These were the goods that would begin to flow into the illicit economy. But smuggling also helped alleviate other shortfalls in the new economy. And during the course of my research, I discovered these very interesting, expansive smuggling networks that would link different state-owned enterprises and factories. They would traffic goods like nylon, like machine tools, and so forth. These were goods that were eventually used by the factories themselves to make other goods. These were goods, some of which that were produced in capitalist countries. Goods from Japan, goods from West Germany, goods from other parts of Western Europe. And all of these goods would flow into China through Hong Kong, through Macau, through the Pearl River Delta, and eventually through other parts of the country. The smuggling in the early People's Republic was very extensive, but it did not operate completely in the shadows. That is, many officials were very well aware that this was happening. Many officials were aware that many state-owned enterprises, SOEs, they were participating in this illicit economy. In fact, officials, when we read some of these reports, they were very worried that these state-owned enterprises were helping drive the demand for smuggling, as this quote from this report shows. And of course, during this time, during the shift to the command economy, SOEs were becoming the biggest businesses, the biggest factories, the biggest buyers in communist China. So their potential role in stimulating smuggling was not insignificant, meaning they played a really big role in stimulating this illicit economy. So officials knew about it, but what really worried officials, what really worried them was how this participation by the SOEs would legitimate smuggling. One report quoted a common refrain from smugglers. When they arrest smugglers or when they interrogate them, many smugglers said something along these lines. Quote, "If state-owned companies purchase smuggled goods, how can it be called illegal? That is, if the state is doing it, how could it be wrong?" Again, sentiments like this was very widespread. They showed that many people were very aware of how widespread, how deep this practice was. I have many, many other examples. It gives us a sense of how everyone knew about it and were probably concerned about its pernicious influence. And indeed, I have many other examples in my books, many more stories of very dodgy but very enterprising individuals and businesses, but I hope this broad survey should help everyone appreciate how smuggling was not merely a criminal activity. It could also serve as a lens to look at activities that were deemed illegal, deemed illegitimate by authorities, but that these activities were nonetheless widely practiced, they were deeply important, and even somewhat tolerated by everyone else. So let me now move on to the final part of my talk, which is to look at the significance of smuggling, putting this story that I traced within a broader perspective and connecting it to more recent times. Now, in the course of my research on smuggling and on the fight against smuggling in modern China, I discovered some very interesting parallels in some interesting parallels elsewhere in history. In fact, I came to realize this very intricate relationship between smuggling and state power in China was not unique to China. Actually, it held also in many other settings. So indeed, in recent decades, there has been a growth of scholarship, research that have revised our understanding of smuggling's significance and helped us to better appreciate its importance. This is just a sample of new works within the last 10 years or so that rather than focusing on smuggling as a sign of state weakness, this recent scholarship would instead look at how fighting smuggling was actually a sign of state strength. Because fighting smuggling, as this emerging scholarship has discovered, actually helped strengthen states in many ways. So fighting smuggling, this research would argue, would help broadcast official authority. It would help reify territorial claims, meaning that in the fight against smuggling, as officials and state agents would patrol or enforce borders, this is how actually borders become real. Fighting smuggling also helped enforce this line between legal and illegal commerce, all of which helped expand state capacity. Smuggling, as these scholars, and I would argue, offer an important window into understanding the evolution of the modern state, whether you're talking about England and France in the 18th century or the United States in the 19th century. So looking at smuggling, the history of smuggling can help us place China within this broader world historical perspective. Now, meanwhile, smuggling has been and continues to be a major problem in China, even after the reforms and opening after 1978. China, after 1978, was confronted by successive waves of so-called smuggling crises. China kicked off a number of initiatives as part of its economic transition, whether it's loosening domestic controls, tightening foreign commercial ties. All of these created new opportunities for smuggling. When I looked back at this, at the writings by policymakers, journalists, scholars during the 1980s and 1990s, many of them labeled this outburst of smuggling as quote unquote unprecedented. Like, oh my God, this has never happened in China's history. During this time, many observers would claim that this outburst, these smuggling crises, were a direct product of the reforms. Smuggling, they claimed, was this sort of unavoidable byproduct of China rejoining the global economy, of China trying to transition to a more market-oriented economy. Smuggling became a very serious problem for the state, and not surprisingly, smuggling became virtually a prime target of many campaigns in the 1980s, whether you're talking about campaigns, the anti-spiritual pollution campaign, the anti-crime campaign, the strike hard campaign. These were basically campaigns launched by the government during the 1980s, the early 1980s, to tackle an array of social ills. And smuggling was often, very often, their targets. And this fight against smuggling only intensified during the 1990s when former President Jiang Zemin and Premier Zhu Rongji kicked off a massive anti-smuggling campaign as part of this much broader effort to enforce party discipline to curb corruption. So smuggling in the reform era tapped into some very deep-seated anxieties over the very pernicious effects of freewheeling commerce. But I also think that a historical perspective could help us better understand smuggling and understand its suppression in the modern era. Because when smuggling was confronted by these waves of smuggling crises after 1978, I hope that I've already convinced you that a very vibrant underground economy on the coast had already been operating for decades, maybe even, not maybe, definitely for centuries. The reforms after 1978 certainly amplified the scale of this smuggling. It might have transformed the relative profitability of certain goods, certain articles, certain commodities that were trafficked, but they certainly did not create smuggling, meaning that smuggling is not just something that just came out of nowhere after 1978. Moreover, these campaigns against smuggling in the reform era, in post-1978 era, are very notable because they essentially continued the aims of campaigns against smuggling from previous eras, namely strengthening central state power. So in this book, Remaking the Chinese Leviathan, the political scientist Da Liang claimed that anti-smuggling campaigns in the reform era were, quote, a vital step in China's efforts to build a modern regulatory state, and that the crackdown on smuggling turned into a campaign to revamp the relations between state and businesses, rationalize the state, and level the economic playing field. So with all of this in mind, I would argue that the explosion of smuggling and the campaigns against smuggling after 1978 represent more of a continuity than a departure, more of a contest between smugglers on one side trying to defy official controls over the economy, and the Chinese state on the other side trying to realize its overriding aims, its imperative to tax, to regulate, and control commerce for national goals. And when judging from the spate of news stories about coastal smuggling in China today, stories concerning how laws and taxes continue to encourage smuggling of all kinds, this contest between state and smuggler is unlikely to end anytime soon, if ever. So I hope all of this, I hope this talk has enticed all of you to read my book, to engage with its arguments, but even if I have not been able to do so, then at least I hope that this talk has convinced you of the book's overall point, namely that smuggling was more than just some underground activity, some marginal activity in the shadows. It was in fact a critical driver of important historical changes. And with that, I am going to end my presentation here. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much for that really interesting talk. Have you any questions from the floor? We have 15 or 20 minutes, so we start with you.
Okay. Hi, thank you for this very interesting talk, and I would agree with you on the point about smuggling and state building. It seems to me that you have mostly kind of focused on seaborne smuggling. I wonder if you have also looked into smuggling over land or on rivers, because that's like a big story that potentially could connect smuggling, state building, and a big story at the time, which is the revolution, right? I was thinking kind of while you were talking, Ralph Saxonberg sort of sought smuggling and how that resistance to the KMT centralization was crucial in sort of having this grassroots momentum that the communists were able to tap into. So that's kind of the main question I have.
Should I just go ahead and field that? Okay, thank you so much. Yes, that's a question that I've received in many presentations. What about frontier smuggling or interior smuggling, riverine smuggling? And in fact, you can write whole books on just looking at different geographies. Why I looked at the coast was basically because this was where it was very active. And I basically make a point in my book that continental smuggling and maritime smuggling, there were many themes that were very similar. There were themes of a lot of evasion, a lot of resistance to taxes. So when you talk about the tactics, when you talk about the incentives for smuggling, they were very similar. Why I looked at the coast was also because the scale was just much bigger. It was much easier for smugglers to move a lot of goods on junks along the coast. Whereas in the land frontiers, the scale was not that it was insignificant; it's just smaller compared to maritime trafficking. But again, continental smuggling, riverine smuggling throughout China is very important. And so, if there are anyone who wants to take on that subject, feel free to do so. I've already said what I need to say on that, at least on the coast. I would actually ask you, I'd like to follow up a quick question for you. You mentioned something about its relationship to revolution. Are you talking, can you elaborate on that? What do you mean by that? Are you talking about?
That's the point that Saxton was talking about, right? How smuggling, sort of anti-smuggling was a state building project.
Yes.
That failed in the end because it provoked revolutionary
Sure.
counter sort of resistance that the communists were able to mobilize,
Yeah.
right, to their own advantage.
Yeah, I would say definitely anti-smuggling initiatives, the policing of trade, all these high taxes, definitely made the general public less happy, more dissatisfied. These very intrusive efforts into everyday life. And indeed, it probably did contribute to the fall of the KMT. But one thing I realized in looking at this broad arc of smuggling, even though maybe it contributed to public discontent that eventually led to the demise of the KMT, many of these policies, many of these institutions, many of these laws that the KMT had passed or established, they were basically taken by the communist government and repackaged. So when you look at, for instance, these anti-smuggling laws from before 1949, after 1949, the names have changed, but if you look at them, they're actually very, very similar. And also the people running some of these institutions, like the Chinese Maritime Customs Service, some of the leadership had changed at the top before and after 1949, but the rank and file were the same people. And also, what I discovered was that even the policies that would lead to some of this public discontent, high taxes and so forth, the communist government actually, took it over and did the same thing. In fact, one of the reasons that led to an outburst of smuggling during the Republican period was high tariffs on foreign goods. The communist government took the same tariffs and basically raised it. They were animated by the same pro-industry, anti-commerce, kind of ideology. So, yes, I grant you that certainly intrusive state-building efforts fed into public discontent. But I'm not exactly, I wouldn't say exactly that these efforts failed, because in many ways they were inherited, repackaged, and then repurposed by the new government.
So my follow-up would be just why,
Sure.
Why the communists succeed where the KMT failed?
That's a good question, because there is now a greater understanding, a greater appreciation for the challenges faced by the nationalists. They were a victim in some ways. You can argue. I don't want to say, oh, poor Chiang Kai-shek and the nationalists or anything like that. But when you actually look at the history of Republican China, the regime facing all of these challenges, whether domestic and international, and then of course 8 years of war, and then after war was over, there was a communist insurgency. So I can't offer right off the top of my head like an answer to that, but I would say that maybe that the failure for the KMT rested not in these intrusive state building efforts, because also, by the way, these intrusive state building efforts were, again, also existed in other parts, other contexts. Like for instance, when you look at 19th century United States, what was the #1 source of federal funding in the United States during the 19th century? It was tariffs, customs duties. When you think of the federal government in the 19th century, what was the largest component was the Treasury Department, because of its anti-smuggling fleet, customs officials, and they also, the United States, also fought some very, very vicious anti-smuggling campaigns. And of course, going back again to the 18th century, France and Great Britain. At the time when Adam Smith, for instance, was writing about the virtues of free trade, he was writing at a time when tariffs were very, very high. He was writing this because he was seeing some of the pernicious effect of British state-building policies with high tariffs and really vicious customs enforcement. So yeah, we can talk about that.
Thanks for your wonderful talk here.
Sorry, oh, there you go.
I wonder whether you see some similar pattern between the scale of smuggling and the scale of Chinese immigrants, like illegal diaspora or undocumented diaspora. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for that question. Another question that I get when I talk about smuggling, people are like, "Oh, are you talking about people smuggling and so forth?" The reason why I don't talk about it as much, at least in my research, is that I was looking at the relationship between trafficking and policy regarding fiscal policies, like basically how much money they were getting, and people didn't really fall into that. Many of this trafficking of humans or human smuggling didn't really unfold until, at least from China. I mean, there were episodes of that throughout Chinese history, but it really didn't become a major issue until after 1978. There were, of course, people coming from China to the United States using all sorts of interesting tactics, but the scale didn't really grow until after 1978. And so many of the dynamics I talk about, whether this relationship between laws and smuggling, this is definitely something that you can apply in looking at human smuggling, human trafficking. The reason why there's human trafficking is because of these very restrictive laws on migration, on movement. So you can definitely see the same logic playing out, but it's just not something that I happen to look at. And also, when you do a search for smuggling in China, just do it right now in Amazon. My book, unfortunately, does not come up first, but if you do that, the first books that usually come up are like human smuggling, human trafficking, snakehead, and so forth. So my intervention, I guess, was to shift the focus away from just human trafficking, human smuggling, because there's actually a lot of work that's been done on that. So at least from my perspective.
Oh, okay. Thank you for a really thought-provoking talk. So I have two questions. The first is a terminology question.
Mm-hmm.
So you talk about smuggling, which for me, as somebody who doesn't know anything about the subject, seems to focus on the movement of goods across a border.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in the kind of terms that the Chinese sources use to talk about these things. And in particular, do they make any distinction, and do you have any analytical differentiation between smuggling, black market, gray market? Because it seems that there are different goods. There are goods that are brought in because they're positively illegal.
Mm-hmm.
There are goods that are brought in because people want to avoid taxes.
Yep.
And then in thinking about, the government officials who are buying these things, I can't help but think of, the former Soviet Union, where the black market basically is there as a public safety valve. It's a supplement, so people with resources can get the stuff they couldn't otherwise get through the state, allocation system. So I'm interested in the differentiation between that. And the second question I have is related to enforcement. To what extent, I'm thinking about illegal immigration, right? Now in the US, the burden of enforcement falls on the immigrants, the migrant workers themselves, and the companies that hire them, they get off scot-free, right? So to what extent was there any differential enforcement along these different supply chains as they were launching these, what you're calling the anti-smuggling campaigns?
Okay, thank you so much. These are great questions. So that's a great question about the terms, what was considered smuggling. I make the point, or at least I make the point that smuggling is a fundamentally illegal issue. Basically, smuggling is just trade, unless there's laws or there's any kind of taxation against it. Basically, there are different methods of smuggling, different goods that are smuggled. There is, for instance, contraband, which is goods that are prohibited, like absolutely prohibited from being smuggled, from being imported. There are goods where they're highly taxed, but they're perfectly legal. Goods like sugar, for instance. Sugar was widely smuggled. It's perfectly legal to consume sugar. You can do it as long as you pay your taxes on it. But another form of smuggling is just, basically trying to get around customs agents so they don't have to pay taxes on it. Other violations of smuggling also include basically moving goods from, let's say, one port to another when you shouldn't, when you cross certain boundaries. And so when I had to look and find out, well, what did smuggling really mean? I found out that all of these definitions changed over time. I mean, it's very easy to think, oh yeah, they've always been, the trafficking of, let's say, opium, that's always been illegal, right? Well, when you actually look at the laws themselves, they changed quite a bit over time. Laws that govern the trafficking of narcotics, like morphine and so forth, these things did not really emerge until the 1920s. So we had to look at laws, and the terms they used were very different. I mean, the modern Chinese term for smuggling is 走私, but when you look back into history, they also used different terms, which was very frustrating as a historian when I'm trying to do keyword searches. But it's really funny how to understand the different ways they conceived of it. There are words like 私运, which is like privately transporting. there are goods like 漏税, which means like tax evasion, and so forth. And so we have to be very careful. Even though I use the word smuggling, I do, at least in my book, try to make differences in the types of commodities and methods of smuggling that are practiced. And of course, I make the point that just because the state says it was illegal doesn't mean that the ordinary people believe that as well. I mean, there are many, many cases, for instance, where I have fishermen who who basically get caught for smuggling because they basically supposedly sailed from one port to another without the proper papers and whatnot. And when you read the legal cases, when you read their testimonies, they basically say, hey, I've been doing this for, my daddy's been doing this, I'm doing this, why are you hassling me? The idea is basically, I didn't cross any borders, the borders crossed me, which they're right, they're right. And of course, trying to enforce this takes a lot of effort. And your question about the second economy, yes, this is actually very pervasive. Black markets, gray markets within command economies produce, scholars have discovered that they produce a parallel economy known as a second economy. This is something that is, you see in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe. Many people have done a lot of research, social scientists have done a lot of research on this, especially looking at China during the 1980s when they were trying to compare the People's Republic with the Soviet Union and so forth. What I do with this is trying to look at this literature and go back in time to argue, again, that this whole illicit economy didn't just emerge after reforms. This was very much at the heart of the PRC and even much further. And then your final question about enforcement. Yes, many times when you look at how enforcement was conducted, the burden often fell on those who, consumers, small businesses, and so forth, the big dogs who actually engage in smuggling, the big businesses, the government officials who are playing both sides of the game, or relatives of, let's say, Chiang Kai-shek. These people don't appear in the records. They don't get called to courts, but everybody knew about it. So again, this is why we cannot rely just on official sources, because if we look on official sources, you'll see the poor fisherman, you'll see the villager, the poor villager who basically, the woman, for instance, there's a lot of women traffickers, women smugglers, because this is one of the very few professions, so-called professions, that they can actually do. It's actually really easy if you were a woman and during the early 20th century locked out of a lot of professions to basically go across the border to Hong Kong, buy a few bags of sugar, carry it back as like, little baby and pretend that it's a baby and, sell it in China for a profit. So yes, so there is a lot of unevenness in how enforcement fell upon different sectors of the society and economy.
Oh, hi. Hi, Professor Tai. Thank you for a fascinating introduction to a very important book that should be read by scholars of modern China, legal history, and economic history.
I hope so, yes.
Yeah, when I was reading the book, it seems to me that one of the most important intervention you are making is to share light upon the bottom. So not just to tell the story from the state perspective, but also to put spotlight on the participants of the smuggling activities, right? And you are using non-official sources, like cartoons, stories, to construct your narrative. Mm-hmm. And then there are certainly limitations or challenges involving in using those sources to make historical narratives. Mm-hmm. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about your tactics of overcoming those shortcomings and still make your own argument. Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I guess I guess the way I would answer that is that I take comfort in the fact that criminologists and other scholars of crime men and women much smarter than me have had a very difficult time with this. So if they have a difficult time and I have a difficult time, that's okay. One shortcoming that I basically say is that, look, I understand that there's going to be a lot of cases, instances that are just not going to be captured in a lot of these things. Even though I have a lot of statistics actually on smuggling in my book, I also know that there's a lot of limitations. But nonetheless, these statistics, if we read against the grain, not like saying, oh, this is what 63.2% of smuggling happened in right here. As long as we don't take that too literally, I think there are some interesting ways we can interpret that. So for instance, when you look at statistics on smuggling, you notice that even though they don't capture everything, a lot of the cases of smuggling could tell you where generally it happens. So for instance, I looked at statistics on smuggling before 1949, after 1949. I discovered that more than 60% of cases happen around the Pearl River Delta, which tells you that both trafficking, the patterns of trafficking, the patterns of enforcement, again, putting aside the question of whether this is quote unquote accurate or not, it tells you more or less that this is where a lot of activities were focused, or at least this is where most of the enforcement was focused. So again, reading against the grain could really illuminate that, and also putting these sources into conversation and dialogue with one another. One of the things I really liked to do was to find a court case, for instance, of a smuggling incident. Read the testimonies, read the judgment, read all the stuff that was in that court case, and then look at the newspapers or magazines that might talk about that very same case. And you would get some very interesting perspectives. So for instance, I found in one customs record, there was a case where they casually mentioned how in the course of fighting smuggling, some woman jumped off the ship. She had all this sugar with her. When she saw the police or the customs officials pursuing her, she jumped off the ship and she apparently drowned because she had all this sugar. And then I read a newspaper article of that very same incident, describing, again, it's generally the same. The actual facts are not in dispute, but it was very interesting to get a different perspective. And so I try to use these different perspectives to speak to one another. And then, of course, the political cartoons, which, nobody asked me to do this, but I'm going to do it anyway. So I'm going to show you some of the cartoons I have. So this is a cartoon that I think also tells us how smuggling was viewed and used as this sort of this kind of a vehicle to talk about broader anxiety. So this is a cartoon about smuggling in the 1930s. 走私问题的另一解释. So another explanation for the smuggling problem. So here you have in panel 1, you have 国货, which is like Chinese goods, national goods, being solicited by this woman, Jian Shang, which is corrupt merchant, venal merchant. He, as you can see, wearing clothes that are kind of tattered, doesn't have much money. And then in this panel, you have this gentleman wearing very nice clothes, 私货, like smuggled goods. How smuggled goods and corrupt merchants bond together. Their relationship is discovered by national goods, and here in this final panel, smuggled goods and venal merchant together beat up this national goods, Chinese goods. The idea here is that this cartoon shows us how smuggling is used to talk about not just smuggling itself, but also themes of nationalism. This idea that somehow smuggling is bad for China, bad for Chinese goods. So we can use non-official sources to talk about this. This is stuff that official sources don't. They talk about it, but this I think really shows some interesting perspectives. Yeah, sure. Yes.
We have a question on this side.
Yes.
Thank you for a very interesting presentation. My question is in some way touched upon by Ili, but the term used is enforcement. But here, my interest in the relationship between smuggling and corruption.
Corruption, yes.
Yes, and also I would like to hear your comparison of 3 different regimes. I say 3 because the socialist period, the command economy is very different from the market economy. Market, we're all familiar with that. The corruption was rampant, even the military involved in armies and navies. The most recent story is the navies shipped Australian powdered milk.
Yes, yes, yes.
So, but the first case I noticed is that you note in the 1930s that the private company from Japan and distributed by post office, you said.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that means, from early on, in the modern nation state building, smuggling is always connected with the corruption, right?
Yep.
But I'm curious about the middle period, the socialist period.
Mm-hmm.
You emphasized it's continued, but I would like to know if there's any nuanced difference
Okay.
in relation to corruption.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay,
Thank you so
thank you.
much for that question about the relationship between corruption and smuggling, which I take it as the last. I'll go ahead. Okay, so basically, just like smuggling, the question of corruption is, well, how is corruption defined? Because the assumption is that state agents should rigorously enforce the law, collect the amount of money that is supposedly, that they're supposed to collect and then pass along to the state. If you look at in early modern states, a lot of customs, a lot of state agents were basically given a lot of freedom to collect money. I mean, they would basically say, I would like to buy a position to collect duties, and basically the state is subcontracting this to them. But states would eventually try to recapture that power by creating their own bureaucracies and their own institutions to actually collect tariffs. And by the time that you would get to the early PRC, what would happen is, of course, you'd see corruption, but then the question also is, if a customs agent lets some goods pass because the state-owned factory needs these goods, is that corruption or not? Well, technically it could be, but maybe the state agent isn't necessarily profiting from it. What I think is certainly an important factor is that there are opportunities when many people are charged with enforcing laws. There are opportunities for corruption. So in this particular instance, the post office, it's not the entire post office that was corrupt. It was just basically one mailman who basically saw an opportunity and used his position to sort of pass along goods, to basically tell his superiors, oh yes, they pay tariffs, but in fact they did not. There are many cases like this. So I do see a lot of continuities over time where individuals who are charged with enforcement, charged with surveillance, would try to make money off of that. And also, as the case that you were talking about, military officials engaged in quote-unquote smuggling. This is something that's been happening throughout the 20th century. So for instance, in the 1930s, when the nationalist government in Nanjing levies these really high tariffs, tariffs on sugar, for instance. Again, sugar is very, tariffs of 70, 100, 150%. Some other military officials, the Chinese Navy, discovered, actually, we can buy some goods, buy some sugar in Hong Kong, and then using our immunity as Chinese Navy, we can then ship it to Guangdong or Guangzhou or wherever and sell it. And so there's lots of cases of this where the central government basically had to discipline local officials to try to enforce national laws. And from the perspective of the local officials, it's like, look, if we enforce these collect these tariffs, the money just goes to the central government. It doesn't, we don't get to keep it. Why should we enforce these laws? This tension between central and local, this is something that has existed throughout time, and it exists in China today. I mean, there's a lot of instances of smuggling cases where local officials kind of look the other way because it doesn't really hurt them. The money would have gone to Beijing, and so forth. So there are those are the continuities that I do see.
Okay, so with that very exhaustive answer, I'm going to close discussion. And could we please thank Professor Tai for an excellent
Thank you.
lecture.